Okay, well, I believe we're live now, so thank you everyone for joining us today. Excuse me, apologies, I thought my Zoom had closed there. My name is Dr. John Collins. I'm Executive Director of the International Drug Policy Unit at LSE. I'm also a Fellow of the LSE US Centre, and I'm Editor-in-Chief of the Journal of Illicit Economies and Development at LSE Press. It's my pleasure to welcome you to what should be, we think, a very timely and relevant event today, which is a discussion on the impacts of COVID-19 on illicit markets, and indeed also the impact of illicit markets on efforts to contain COVID-19, because there is a clear overlap between the two. We have an outstanding panel today. We've got people from the United Kingdom, various parts of North America and Brazil. But before I turn to our panel, I just want to say a couple of quick thank yous. Firstly, I want to say thank you to Antigone, Alan, and the entire team at LSE Events. They've been absolutely fantastic to work with, as always. Thank you to Charlotte Eaton, our Events and Communications Coordinator at LSE IDPU. Thank you to our Administrative Coordinator at LSE IDPU, Sally Ann Oates, who maybe I shouldn't say, but she's also at home with a bad back today as well. So we send our thoughts to her at this time. Thanks also to our host centre, the LSE US Centre, for all of their help and support with this. So Centre Manager Ade, Professor Trubovitz, Chris Gilson, Saga, and Michaela. I also want to thank our audience for joining us from effectively what we think is all parts around the world, and taking the time to really be part of this discussion today. And this will be an interactive discussion. This will be something that we want to see the audience engaged with. And to begin that, I'll come to in a moment how we can increase audience engagement later. But to begin that, please do feel free to tweet. So our hashtag for today's event is hashtag LSE COVID-19. This online event will also be recorded and will be made available as a podcast. So after, we're going to have we have 5 presentations, and after these will last about 5 minutes each. And after these, we'll go into a Q&A. So to submit your questions, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Questions will be submitted to myself. I will do my very best to pose as many of these as possible to the speakers and to try and ensure an engaged and free-flowing discussion. We want to ensure great diversity in people who are asking questions. But please do let us know your name and affiliation. And we're also particularly delighted to hear from LSE students, alumni, and incoming students. So if you are one, please do let us know. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge some exceptional groups at this time. And the firstly is that we talk a lot about frontline service providers in the current crisis, and rightly so. But I'd particularly like to acknowledge low threshold service providers and harm reductionists all around the world who are right now working to keep people safe, healthy, and alive. These groups work in extremely difficult circumstances in the best of times, working with some of the most marginalized groups, some of the most stigmatized groups, and frankly, some of the most criminalized groups in society. And really, this is a very difficult time for them. So while we are having this policy discussion here, our thoughts do go out to them. I'd also like to take a moment to acknowledge the absolutely terrible event and indeed events that have precipitated the protests in the United States and now around the world. And indeed, frankly, the terrible events that we see on a daily basis around the world. Rather than try to say more on this, I saw Patrick Gaspard, the president of Open Society Foundations, paraphrasing, I think it was Martin Luther King Jr., where he said, "Injustice to one is injustice to all." So with that said, I'd just like to take a very brief few moments now here that we all just take a breath and acknowledge those who've lost their lives, and also those who live but are striving to make this world a more just place. Okay, with that said, first up today we have a really outstanding panel. So first up we've Naomi Burke-Shyne. She's Executive Director of Harm Reduction International and has more than 10 years of international experience at the intersection of harm reduction, HIV, and human rights. She's a member of the Strategic Advisory Group to the UN on HIV and drug use, a member of the Global Fund Technical Review Panel for Human Rights and Gender, and a member of the World Health Organization Guidelines Group on ensuring balance in national policies and controlled substances. Following her, we have Dr. Kasia Malinowska. She's Director of the Global Drug Policy Program at the Open Society Foundations. She previously led the Open Society's International Harm Reduction Development Program, which supports the health and human rights of people who use drugs. She publishes regularly on drug policy as it relates to women, social justice, health, human rights, civil society and governance, and she co-authored Poland's first national AIDS program. Jason Eligh is a senior expert at the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. He is an illicit drug market and policy analyst who has researched, developed, and led technical cooperation and assistance initiatives addressing illicit drugs across African and Asian geographies. Gabriel Feltran is a professor in the Department of Sociology at the Federal University of São Carlos in Brazil, and currently senior researcher at the Brazilian Center for Planning and Analysis. His current research looks at criminal groups and illegal markets in Brazil, focusing on collective action, marginalization, groups, and the criminal world in São Paulo. And finally, we'll have Alexander Söderholm, who's a policy coordinator of the LSE International Drug Policy Unit. He's managing editor of the Journal of Illicit Economies and Development, and he's currently a PhD candidate in social policy at the LSE, with a research project titled Drugs, Livelihood and Development, the Role of Illicit Markets in Determining Development Outcomes. So with all of those introductions out of the way, I'll hand over to our first speaker, which is Naomi Burke-Shyne.
Thank you, John. I work for Harm Reduction International, as John said. Harm Reduction International works to reduce the negative impacts of drug use and drug policy, and to promote the rights of people who use drugs through research and advocacy. I'm glad we can start this conversation by talking about the people involved, the people at the center of this. So with that, according to UNODC, there are 271 million people around the world who use drugs. About a third of them are women. Zooming in further, we know that there's more than 15 million people around the world who inject drugs. About a third of this group are younger than 25 years of age. Approximately 21% of them have recently experienced homelessness or unstable housing, and almost 60%, a staggering 60%, have a history of incarceration. So we're looking at a population with multiple levels of vulnerability. In the context of the current pandemic, people who use drugs face the same risks as the general population, but can be exposed to additional risks if they have other medical conditions, such as HIV, hepatitis, or TB. These are all common amongst people who inject drugs. Or the settings in which they consume drugs are crowded, closed, or lack access to soap, water, and sterile equipment. On top of this, like with all markets, COVID has disrupted illicit drug markets. Changes to supply, changes to access, changes to personal contacts, all change the risk factors that people encounter when they use drugs. So harm reduction services come in here. Harm reduction services play a critical role in supporting people who use drugs to make informed choices and stay healthy. Around the world, COVID has deeply impacted harm reduction services. And we see simultaneously great shutdowns and restrictions, vast shortages in access to the appropriate PPE required to keep service providers safe. But at the same time, we see remarkable reforms and innovation. Standout examples include how the network of people who use drugs around the world have translated and disseminated information to keep the community safe as possible, to understand the implications of COVID. In Switzerland, Zurich was forced to shut down its 3 supervised consumption sites in March. Within 24 hours, it had mobilized to open an outdoor supervised consumption facility. An unexpected outcome of the pandemic is also a shift in willingness to provide methadone or other opioid treatment in the form of take-home dose. In many countries, for many people, you can access methadone only via a supervised daily dose. From Ukraine to Morocco, Nepal and India to New York, we're seeing flexibilities allowing people to take home their medicine, often for the first time and often for a wider group than ever before. This allows people to shelter during COVID, but also represents an interesting opening of the control paradigm of drug treatment in the medium to long term. British Columbia and Canada, who are often a leader in health-based approaches to drug use, recognize a dual public health emergency back in March. They face COVID, but they also face an overdose crisis. And they put in place measures empowering pharmacists to renew and provide extended prescriptions, including of controlled medicines like methadone, and to permit prescribers new flexibilities, edging us closer to safe supply, ensuring people understand the full contents of what they're consuming. Going forward, most likely into an economic crisis, social and healthcare programs need to be pragmatic, holistic, and more person-centered than ever before to protect these vulnerable groups. I'll make one final point on the crossover between people who use drugs and people in prison and detention. The COVID prison release or decongestion strategies raise big questions about our approach to punishment and incarceration, and Kasia will speak to this further. I think it's worth pointing out that these schemes need to be supported by big picture thinking. That means thinking about the release process, downstream, if you will, and thinking about what results in imprisonment in the first place, so upstream. Downstream, we're observing vast complexities at every stage of implementation of prison release schemes in ensuring the health and the safety of the individuals involved. It's worth pointing out that a number of countries are even excluding otherwise eligible prisoners from release if they can't provide a home address, like a fixed permanent address. And we've counted 9 countries taking this approach. There are practical components to COVID shielding and sheltering, of course, but this is a policy which further disadvantages the most vulnerable and suggests that prison release schemes are an option only where a state can effectively shrug its responsibility for an individual. This is particularly relevant for people who use drugs, because I started this presentation by noting that about 1/5 of all people who use drugs have experienced homelessness, inject drugs. Upstream, while governments around the world are announcing these schemes, they continue to arrest and detain citizens for drug offences. There's no point in running these amnesty schemes or decongestion schemes if there's been no upstream effort to address the issues of arrest and policing. I say this, as John said, just a week after George Floyd was murdered by a police officer in Minneapolis. And anti-racist protesters in the US and around the world are rightly questioning state funding for punitive law enforcement when community health and social programs are in such desperate need of support. So, in addition to potential for reform of prisons, there's an important discussion to be had about drug policy moving away from law enforcement in the months and years to come, with a view to fostering healthier, safer societies. Thanks, John.
Great. We'll go now to Kasia Malinowska from Open Society Foundations. Okay, we seem to have momentarily lost Kasia, so we're going to actually just go straight on to our next speaker, which is Jason Eligh from the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime.
Thanks, John. The coronavirus is not a disruptor to the the core illicit drug industry itself, but to its operating environment. We've got to remember that historically drug organizations have had to adapt to many environmental disruptors that have challenged their operations. They've learned from these historically and become more resilient generally as a result. I guess my role here is to take a higher level look at the drug industry, the global drug industry itself in light of COVID-19. Generally speaking, cultivation and harvest of coca leaves, opium poppies, cannabis has been at normal levels. Eradication has generally decreased as a result of COVID-19, and yields in some places have even increased. Production itself, well, there have been some small blips, particularly in relation to cocaine in South America, itself has also continued to generally be unaffected. This is not a situation similar to several years ago where the crops themselves have been impacted in some way. Instead, we have healthy harvests coming out. Where we see some significant changes, however, are in the distribution and the flows of illicit drugs. While supply continues to flow from origin through transit points to destination, there are several points that have come to light. First, we have to recognize that closed borders in those countries, in those areas where borders have been closed, are not really closed. We're not talking about a wall that has been put into place to stop all traffic back and forth. The borders remain permeable. While traffic has been limited in most places to commercial traffic, where the borders are closed, there still is a significant amount of traffic passing through, and certainly more than we might realize ourselves. We also have to remember that there are many borders that aren't closed. There are many parts of the world where either they haven't taken the decision to close their borders, or it's just not possible to close the border. It's not possible to police the border in its entirety. So there remains a strong ability of drug supplies to continue to move across these borders. There's been an increase in the use of air to move drugs. Of course, that would be expected when a majority of air traffic in the European market, North American market in particular, has been restricted. So the common route of smuggling drugs through cargo or through baggage or internally has become a method that is not viable during the COVID times. There has, however, apparently been an increase in maritime traffic and overland traffic. Maritime in the sense that we're still seeing seizures occurring in shipping traffic moving in. A lot of ports are not policed to the same degree that air borders and airports are being policed. And there are overland transit points that are either not policed or are excluded from closer scrutiny under COVID-19. For example, rail traffic in many places is excluded from the stringent examination procedures that are in place in other borders. We've seen also, a decrease in smaller loads, smaller movements of goods. We're seeing an increase in larger volumes. So it appears that organizations are making up for the absence of many ants carrying many packages by having a larger volume going in less frequent amounts to try and run the barricade, as it were. If we look at law enforcement and we look at seizures as an example maybe of what is happening, we can see year on year from the period January to May 2019 and January to the end of May 2020, we've seen actually globally a reduction in seizures, in seizure events by about 25%. So the seizures in the same period this year have been down by about a quarter. And this is down across the three major drug types. If we look at heroin, cocaine, and methamphetamine. Cannabis is a bit more difficult because it's legal in some places and illegal in others. However, if we look at the months of March and April, which have been generally the core months of lockdown in many countries, we see a 50% decrease in seizures. So it's skewed significantly to those two periods. What does that mean? Well, I think it's fair to say right now we're really not sure, but it's possible that we're looking at, because of a decrease in airflows, we're seeing a decrease in what is one of the more common methods of interdicting drug flows, capturing the single smugglers or capturing cargo through air. Are we seeing distracted law enforcement? Certainly in many places. Law enforcement agencies have been used to enforce COVID-19 quarantine restrictions. Their focus has changed in some places from a primary focus on interdiction to a focus on interdicting, from a focus on interdicting drugs to interdicting COVID-19 positive patients, identifying people who may or may not be coming in illegally in that sense. We're seeing law enforcement agencies that are affected themselves by COVID-19, a reduction in numbers, an increase in sicknesses. Are we also seeing, however, a change in flows and a change in volume of traffic? Are drug organizations using different ways, taking different routes? Certainly, we've seen the beginnings of that in Northern Africa, in the Indian Ocean as well, where seizures are occurring in places where otherwise they hadn't in the past, or volume has increased to a level where it generally wasn't in the past. So I think it's fair to say that we're in a learning environment in this sense, but if history is any lesson, it's demonstrating that the organizations are continuing to adapt, continuing to find different ways to supply their markets. Finally, if I look at destination markets, and Naomi touched on this a little bit as well, generally across the world, we're seeing that supply remains available in most markets. Now, in saying that it's available doesn't mean that it's accessible. And I think that's the big challenge here. In a lot of markets, particularly those where lockdowns have been very stringent, access by people who use drugs to the supply, either the supply nodes or supply more generally, has been very difficult. Now, in some countries, dealers have adapted to the environment by camouflaging themselves in different ways or finding other ways to access their users. And users who are able, those who have a home where they can stay, who have the ability to access darknet markets and things like that, have a phone and they can order in and pay a delivery charge, they're adapting quite well. But the biggest impact is on those users who are homeless, those users who are also perhaps part of the drug working class in a lot of these countries, who deal and use, whose livelihood and the livelihood of their families perhaps rely on the drug market economy that occurs in their country. And as that economy shrinks in some way or becomes a bit more rigid in its ability to operate, the impact is not necessarily felt on those who are holding the drugs, supplying the drugs, transiting the drugs. The impact is felt greatly on those who've lost their daily income, their daily livelihood, whether they're a dealer, they're a transporter, they store drugs. And I think this impact on livelihoods, on local working class, is something that is largely omitted, but something that I think is significant as well. I'll stop there, John.
Terrific, thanks, thanks, Jason. I see that Kasia is back. So Kasia, how about we go to you next, if that sounds good?
Yes, thank you, and apologies. I think my connection is not that stable, so I switched to the iPhone. I hope it works well enough. Thank you, John. And my job was to speak after Naomi, and I think it's important to underscore what she had said to us, which is that, you know, after all, this is all about people and what happens to people in the light of COVID. And in addition to the health outcomes that Naomi spoke about, I think one of the greatest outcomes next to impact on health is what happens to people in criminal justice system and how criminal justice system relates to people who use drugs. And I've been following this closely in the United States, really from the beginning of the epidemic. And you know, it's really a heartbreaking and heart-wrenching process to follow. We all know United States, a huge incarcerator, particularly for drug-related offenses. Someone between 400 and 500,000 people in the United States are in prison for drug-related offenses. And obviously, impact on COVID on that community and broad prison community is huge. And so it really was no surprise to me, and I think others that work in drug policy space, that the first 2 people to die of COVID in US prison were people who were sentenced there for drug-related offenses. And, you know, and they also, it was Mr. Patrick Jones and Ms. Andrea Circle-Bear, and both of them are showing the insanity of the system, because Mr. Jones has been in prison actually for quite a long time and was actually due to be released at the end of this year. So imagine his family, imagine people around him, imagine Mr. Jones himself, right, on the cusp of leaving prison for a dramatically long prison sentence, and not being and dying of COVID on a cusp. Miss Andrea Circle-Bear was in prison for a year. She died, I think, a month and a half after entering prison. A young woman who was apprehended, who was brought into prison while pregnant. Again, you know, I think the question that this raises for all of us is, you know, if someone has spent 2 or close to 3 decades in prison, do they really need to be there for the last 6 months? Which is what happened to Mr. Jones. I think we as society could have definitely been generous and let him out as soon as the news of the epidemic emerged. And also, did we need to bring Ms. Circle-Bear into prison as the epidemic was beginning? We already knew about that. She was a young pregnant woman with children at home. So the inhumanity of the prison system, of the prison industry, and the fact that drugs play such hugely prominent role, I think is something that we should be looking at closely. And you know, this has been a question for many of us, obviously in the drug policy space for many years. But COVID brings this out, I think, as powerfully as anything else that we've been studying and learning about. So, you know, I live in the state of New Jersey. Our governor, I think, tried to do the right thing and actually relatively early on announced release of over 100 prisoners, some of them for drug offenses. Well, so it happens that most of those folks are still in prison. because the bureaucracy of the system is such, the questions that are raised sort of from that bureaucracy as such, that it actually became quite difficult for people to be released. Now, the trouble, and I think this is what Naomi was pointing out, that if people leave, they have to have a place to go to. There needs to be a harm reduction service for them. There needs to be drug treatment service for them. And in my state of New Jersey, harm reduction services are scarce at the best of times, and they're really scarce right now. So I think 2 folks who actually were released, who were lucky enough to be released, died of overdose within 48 hours of release. So I think the inhumanity of the system is actually quite visible as we now look at COVID and look what happens who are trapped in criminal justice system. Now that's United States. In Latin America, where prisons are operating at about 200% of the capacity, and where drugs and drugs are such a significant reason for which people end up in prison, the situation is as dramatic, if not even more dramatic. So we have the rates of prison inmates have grown faster than the general population. And in Brazil, where the prison population increased by 55%, those incarcerated for drug-related crimes increased by 267%, so 5 times higher. In Colombia, a very similar story. While the prison population recently has grown by 140%, it was the number of people in prison for drugs almost by 300%. So again, I think a question of why are we locking people up? Why are they in the first place? And what are the dramatic consequences for their lives, their families' lives in a situation like this epidemic? Obviously, is something that we should be very loud about and speaking about continuously. I think in Colombia, one of the prisons in Colombia, I'm probably not going to say it right, Villa Vicentios, where prison has become the center of Colombia's COVID outbreak. 900 cases of COVID were discovered, and that is 7% of the total confirmed number of COVID infections in the country. So yeah, I think this connection of COVID and prisons and drugs is incredibly important to look at, and we should be very mindful about getting people out of prison, making sure that they end up in services, and I think decarceration, which we're talking about right now, is definitely not enough, because what we don't want is a situation in which people are let out of prison temporarily or permanently, only so on the other end arrest continue to happen, new people are brought into prisons, and we sort of keep on recycling folks in and out. So many of us have been advocating for decriminalization of personal possession, decriminalization of small-scale sales, of small-scale production. And if there's ever a moment in time to actually make this a serious policy goal, it really is now, at the time of COVID, because it's not only about decarcerating people, but it also is making sure that they don't end up in prison. So let me just make one other point, since I'm sitting right here in New Jersey, 8 kilometers away from Manhattan, where people are protesting, and in my own state as well. Let me just say this, that a lot is now being said about divestment in police and about police brutality and so on. And I think that decrim, just as crucial for decarceration, is also crucial for divestment. Because when you think about how much of police time is being spent chasing people, how much time is chasing drug users, arresting drug users, and actually gives them, sort of weaponizes the police to go after people of color in particular. I think if we pushed hard for decrim, we would definitely that would definitely have an impact on divestment in police and decarceration, and whether that is in United States or across the world. And just a final point that I, again, in light of the current events, that I wanted to make is let's look at Mexico. Let's look at the fact that when President Calderon brought out the military from the barracks onto the streets in response to drug cartels, somehow, that became a new normal, that military was on the streets dealing with civilians. What about Philippines, where Duterte's terror against drug users also, for some people, somewhat, something that they found somewhat acceptable for so-called public safety. But look what happens now. It's exactly the same tactics that are being used against general population. So I think let's look at Brazil. Militarized police in favelas. Again, this same police is now going after people in much broader sense. So I think this big piece that the war on drug has brought into criminal justice system, into how we relate to civilians, is something really important for us to look at. And I think it's this lack of outrage in the beginning around drugs is what contributed to the fact that those exact tools are now used much more broadly in those states and in many others.
Okay, thank you, Kasia, and thanks again to Naomi. Two presentations, I think, that really did reinforce this message in these communities that are so often hidden from these discussions. Okay, next up we've got Gabriel Feltran, speaking of Brazil, who will present on his work there.
Thanks, John. Thanks to the organizers. It's a pleasure to meet Alex again and to be in touch with Jason, Naomi, Kasia. Thanks a lot for the invitation. Well, situation in Brazil is very hard in many senses, but let's talk about COVID. I prepared like 3 points to discuss with you. As Brazil has a lot to do and a very strategic position in many issues now related to drugs and illegal markets in the world. I've been studying the favelas in São Paulo, so I talk specifically about São Paulo, but if you need, after we can talk about the Brazilian situation in a more broader sense. But I've been talking to my interlocutors in the favelas, especially in São Paulo, and what we understood, I will try to summarize in these 3 points. I mean, first point is like internal market, drug market in São Paulo and in Brazil. Second point is the international flows, especially of cocaine that comes from Brazil to Africa and Europe and Middle East and other places. And third point is law enforcement measures here in Brazil. So 1 minute for each. So, like in terms of internal markets, Brazil is consuming a lot of cocaine and cannabis, but cannabis normally come to São Paulo from Paraguay, and cocaine comes from Colombia, Bolivia, also Paraguay and Peru. So cocaine supply chains are much more broader, and they could cope much easierly, I think, with the COVID crisis. As Jason said, like the dealers and people related to those markets, that the operators are very used to emergency and very used to very different situations, and they can cope easily with this. So, for example, the cocaine never stopped to flow in São Paulo during the crisis. Even at the beginning, it became completely normal. And dealers in the favelas and dealers in middle classes, etc., said it was completely normal. It didn't change. So in the retail and everyday life, it continued completely untouched. The cannabis flow stopped, and it been stuck in São Paulo for a couple of weeks at the very beginning of the crisis, and then it suddenly appeared again. I mean, we had a lot of trouble in the Argentinian border and the Paraguayan border during the beginning of the crisis, but I'm sure the dealers could cope and could find another ways and improvise other routes and other ways of making the drug arrive to São Paulo, and it was more or less what happened in other places. So the internal market is mostly untouched now, and if you look at the favelas, at the retail, in the workers class, you will see the dealers in the street using masks. That's the only difference now. So, but everything is completely normal now, normalized again. So, second thing that I don't know very much, it was very interesting to hear Jason's talk, because we've been wondering about what would happen with the cocaine market as the airports were almost closed and the ports were operating differently. So I don't have too much information on this, but I know that the seizures increased a quarter, in 25% in Brazil last month. I mean, for me, it means that probably the dealers had to have different arrangements and different deals to ship their drugs, and it was probably an opportunity to seize a bit more. So, but it's my hypothesis. I don't know exactly what happened, but I heard news about Portugal that was a bit lack of cocaine in Portugal. I'm not sure if it's completely true, but I think that maybe it will be a bit more difficult to cope and to manage the international flows of cocaine now, even if we know that the dealers are completely used to emergency, and the deals to export and etc. are very grassrooted and very provisory deals. So I wonder if the international flow of cocaine coming from Brazil would be very affected or not, but I don't think so in some weeks. And about law enforcement, the drug policies in Brazil and in Latin America are horrible, as you say. So, as you know, so we've been witnessing this last week's a lot of police killings in the favelas. I mean, it was the record since 2001 in São Paulo. 120 guys were killed in the favelas only in São Paulo state last month in April. So we have a kind of very strong polarization between Bolsonaro and the government of the São Paulo state. And also we have a lot of bases from a lot of Bolsonaro supporters coming from the military police and civil police. So we have a lot of trouble in this at this level now, and the type of police they are enforcing is the traditional one. I mean, arresting the small-scale operators of the drug market. So the guys who are dealing in the favelas. I mean, arresting and killing them. So it doesn't touch the market itself. So the guy is substituted the other day, the incarcerated one or the killed one. So we have a kind of policy that is protecting a lot of criminals, so-called criminals. I mean, small-scale workers of those markets. And during COVID crisis, as the news and the press are only talking about COVID, it's very clear for us that this kind of very far right movements that are inside our police forces decided to kill more than incarcerate. especially because there's a lot of discussion of de-incarceration, as Kasia said. So they decide, okay, it's not worth to incarcerate, it's better to kill them. So in Rio and in São Paulo, there's a lot of increase in the killing rates of the small scale operators of the drug market, but also the car theft market that we've been studying a bit more. So the situation is very hard now at this level because it's more unprotected, I would say. Thanks, John.
Okay, thanks, Gabriella. There's lots there, I think, that we can go back into in the Q&A and in the broader discussion. So finally, we've got our own Alexander Söderholm. So over to you, Alex.
Thanks a lot, John. Thanks, Gabriel, and all the previous speakers, and to everyone who's joining us from all different parts of the world. I'll speak a little bit about COVID-19's impact on the Middle East in particular. I'll raise a few key points firstly, and then I'll go into two themes. The first one relating to the impact on drugs and drug users, and the second one on various illicit flows. And the first point I want to raise is that we still know relatively little. There's most likely going to be a lag before any major changes in illicit markets become visible, especially in the Middle East, which is where most countries are at a relatively early stage of the pandemic. But the point I want to raise here is that any changes that we might see in drug flows will most likely disproportionately negatively affect already marginalized and vulnerable drug users and the communities that lie along the drug supply chains. And so this speaks to Jason's point about livelihoods, for example, and also Kasia's point in terms of this is about people. The Middle East, most Middle Eastern countries like close Afghanistan, which is of course the world's foremost supplier of opiates, so opium and heroin, and so purity is relatively high. However, when prices increase or purity decreases, we've consistently seen that drug-related harms intensify as users, for example, move towards more harmful modes of consumption, such as injecting drugs rather than smoking them. And this is one of the impacts that COVID might have if it squeezes these markets and changes purity and pricing, which we've seen to a limited extent in some countries like Iran. The second point I want to make is that in the context of the Middle East, the informal often trumps the formal. And this is a major impact on illicit flows. And this speaks a little bit to Jason's point about borders being permeable. And so 4 decades of sanctions against Iran, also sanctions against Syria, Hezbollah, various armed groups in the region, has transformed the Middle East, wherein now a massive amount of trade is conducted informally or illegally across unofficial border crossings. And so this is something that we need to keep an eye on in relation to COVID. Now, due to the recurrent and ongoing conflict and insecurity across the region, there's a large number of individuals who are vulnerable to becoming either involved with illicit economies as consumers of drugs or low-level traffickers or dealers. We don't know what impact COVID-19 is going to have on these conflicts and the illicit markets and flows that have taken a strong foothold in both Yemen and Syria, for example. These economies already thrive in contexts of insecurity, and this is something that we will likely see continue. And this is of utmost significance to the 24 million people in need of humanitarian assistance and millions surviving on emergency food aid in Yemen alone, and the more than 6 million internally displaced persons and 130,000 detainees in regime prisons in Syria. So moving on to prisons, in a region where non-punitive responses are severely lacking and prisons are overcrowded, conditions are generally horrible in these penitentiary settings, we have seen some positive developments actually in countries like Iran, Iraq, Jordan, Turkey, and Yemen, where some prisoners have been released. And this is really an opportunity, as Naomi said, to talk about both the upstream and downstream and think more holistically about punitiveness and incarceration. And we need to think about what happens with people that we do release, as Kasia said. One of the problems in the Middle East is that people are only released on bail or having a fixed abode, which many do not have. And because of the fact that drugs offenses are so harshly punished in the Middle East in particular, those sentences would go over kind of the threshold of people who are being considered for release due to COVID, which is usually below a 3 or 5 year incarceration or time in prison. And lastly, I want to just raise a point about the secondary impacts of COVID-19 with a focus on the economy. we know there's a lot of systematic research that has shown a clear link between unemployment, economic recessions, and increasing drug use. The global economic downturn experienced due to COVID-19 is going to have a large impact on the Middle East, where countries are reliant on natural resources such as oil. But I think more importantly, it's going to have a large impact perhaps on the many NGOs, the fantastic NGOs who operate in the Middle East in an already very unstable and difficult environment to do any drugs-related work. This includes organizations like SCOON and SIDC in Lebanon, Reba Society, Congress 60 in Iran, who are doing some incredible work at the front line of the harms related to drug use. Now, the funding of many of these NGOs is inevitably going to change and is going to be impacted by this global economic downturn, which will mean lower service provision in environments where services are already very scarce. Now, I just want to pick up on two themes very briefly, and the first one is related to the vulnerable and marginalized drug users. And I want to first say that it is really in times of crises when conceptions of drug users come to the fore. Preceding COVID-19, drug users have often been portrayed as a risk and threat to public health, as vectors of disease, as threats to the social order and health of urban environments. And as such, it's no surprise that due to COVID-19, we're now hearing reports of drug users being mopped up and cleaned off the streets in several urban environments. Mostly recently, this took place last week in the Shush area of southern Tehran, where hundreds of individuals were forcibly and arbitrarily detained to undergo forced COVID-19 tests. Now, we still don't know what's happening with drug users testing positive, but it's been proposed that those who are positive to COVID-19 are going to first be detained in central facilities before being sent to so-called drug treatment camps for detoxification and rehabilitation. Now, a related issue is, of course, ongoing conflict and insecurity. And there's research that shows that, well, in the aftermath of crisis is really when we might see drug use increasing, when things return to sort of a new normalcy. In Iran, for example, in 2003, there was a large earthquake in Bam, in which over 26,000 people were killed. And what we saw after the earthquake was that users moved towards more harmful modes of consumption because of a lack of supply, shifts in the market to cope with trauma. So especially from smoking heroin, for example, to swallowing or injecting. And this is something that we might see in the aftermath of COVID-19. Now, we're already seeing some of these impacts in Lebanon. Friends from SCOON, a non-profit organization that provides drug treatment services and advocacy on behalf of drug users, they very kindly shared some preliminary data from an ongoing research project related to the impacts of COVID-19 on their beneficiaries. And the main issues reported by service users was in relation to the financial situation. So 42% of service users who had a job before COVID-19 struck have reported either receiving a 50% salary cut or loss of employment entirely. 47% of beneficiaries on opioid substitution therapy are having difficulty paying for the treatment. And that's resulting in reduced dosages or skipping taking the medicines altogether. In terms of substance use, there's already an increase in alcohol, benzos, and cannabis intake to reduce anxiety and insomnia. So we're already seeing some of these changes in terms of how the methods and modes of drug consumption are changing, and the vulnerabilities by drug users are being exacerbated basically by the situation. And I'll just very briefly, because I know I've run over time, touch upon the kind of supply chain issues of these illicit markets. As mentioned previously by Jason and by Gabriel, I mean, these flows are already incredibly resilient and adaptive due to operating in the realm of the illegal. Decades of sanctions against countries in the Middle East have meant that large numbers of people have become reliant on informal or illegal trade channels to bypass sanctions and law enforcement interdiction. Not of all this trade is illicit goods, much of it is regular consumer goods. And what we're seeing now, some research from Afghanistan, for example, is showing that legal goods coming through these unofficial channels is increasing when the borders are closing. And again, prices of labor in Afghanistan in terms of opium production is stable, the harvest is not reducing, and so on and so forth. So there's some stability in terms of the resilience of these flows, and actually they might increase because of the COVID situation, because we have more legal goods flowing through these channels. The main question perhaps is, how is this going to affect the region's ongoing conflicts? Now we know existing vulnerabilities, already fragile health systems, limited availability of medical supplies makes COVID-19 a bigger risk to public health in conflict zones. Health workers have already been targeted in the conflicts of Syria and Yemen. There are large numbers of refugees and IDPs in the region. And what we know in terms of Syria and Yemen in particular is that organized crime groups and armed groups have already exploited these conflicts to establish lucrative illicit economies. That's the trafficking of antiquities, drugs and oil in Syria, for example, or arms and drugs in Yemen, and so on and so forth. I think we can expect these issues to become further protracted and entrenched due to COVID, rather than seeing any massive disruption to these illicit economies, as they already thrive in these contexts. And so COVID might really pose opportunities rather than constraints to some of these armed and organized crime groups. With that, I'll hand back to the chair. Thank you.
Super. Thanks, Alex. It's very interesting points. And it really is remarkable to see these kind of common threads emerging across very different geographies and thematic areas. I see we've got some great questions already. I would encourage people to submit your Q&A by clicking on the Q&A at the bottom of the screen. But maybe just to kick things off, I'll use the chair's prerogative, and I'd like to pose two questions to everybody, and you can focus on one more than others. And I'd ask, I know some people have started to address them, so you can try keep them brief. But the first one would be, what would you think are the long-term effects of COVID on illicit markets or drug markets, or policy towards, say, people who use drugs? And number two, what can and should policymakers do right now? Right, what is the immediate thing that you would like to see to address this? So we'll go back in order. So we'll start with Naomi.
Fabulous. I love going first. I'm going to go with what policymakers should do right now. I think going to the kind of the point at the top of the agenda, and something that's been on everyone's mind with the protests in the US, the deeply kind of entrenched nature of drug law enforcement and racism, and how it impacts most on the poorest in society. I think policymakers can use this crisis situation to make sure they're putting their funding in the right place, to fund the social and health and policy program, social and health programs. They're going to kind of inch us forward in terms of creating societies where people have somewhere to stay at night, where people have enough food. You know, above all of these things, you know, I spoke to harm reduction services, but what we see all across sub-Saharan Africa and Eastern Europe and Asia, people are lacking basic necessities during this period. You know, poverty is only going to get worse with a pending economic crisis. We really need states to come in and make the political commitment in the form of funding to provide like basic social and health services to ensure people can stay safe and have somewhere to live.
Right, Kasia, I think people can just jump in as they like.
So I will, I guess, repeat the points that I made earlier, but let me just give it a slightly different context. So I do think that now is the moment to advocate powerfully by all of us for decriminalization, and by policymakers to actually hear that call. And here's why I think it's important. You know, in the drug policy space in the United States, in criminal justice space in the United States, very often I hear the following statement, that if we deal with criminal justice overall, we will also address the needs of people who are there for drug-related offenses. I don't think that's true. And I don't think that's true for a number of reasons. One, because some people do think that the war on drugs should be gentler and kinder. And so they came up with the idea of drug courts. And we all know what that means in practice. I know that some people are arguing, okay, so let's maybe put in place diversion programs where people will not end up in jail, but they still are subject of dramatic police interaction. And as Naomi pointed out, that is also often racist and very uneven. So I think this assumption that criminal justice reform will take care of drug users and drug-related criminal justice, I'm not finding to be the case. I think we need to be as straightforward as possible and basically say that we need to remove police from interactions with people who are who are charged for particularly non-violent and small drug offenses. So I think that is one important issue to highlight now more than ever. And then on the police divesting, again, if there's no law that clearly limits police interaction with people who use drugs, even if you divest in the police, even if their budgets are a lot smaller, even if the number of police is a lot smaller, I'm pretty certain that drug users will be the people that they go after. And so I think that this needs to happen on both fronts. It needs to happen on a broader criminal justice front, in a broader context of divesting from police, but law on the books has to follow, because otherwise those systems are so experienced and so talented in using drugs, and they've been so weaponized with drug laws to go after most vulnerable, that this will simply continue. So I would say that, again, more than ever, decrim needs to be a priority for policymakers and all of us advocating on drug policy front.
So Jason is next.
Sure. I guess I'll tackle the first question, John. And I would say two things. First, I think there needs to be concern over the potential permanence of the role that law enforcement has taken in many countries in terms of increased securitization and militarization of environmental control. This includes some of the attacks on users that have been raised by Kasia and Naomi, but more broadly, it's a maintenance and an intensification of an approach by law enforcement to drug markets that really hasn't proved effective over the last, you could say, 30 years of the UN Grand Program to respond to drugs, or the last 100 years of prohibition in and of itself. We need to find a different way of policing of law enforcement organization around drug markets, because the current approach just isn't effective by many different ways of measuring it. The second thing is, I think we have to recognize that in many countries, the economic impact of COVID-19 is going to be, in many ways, far more significant and far more impactful than the ongoing public health impact. What I mean here from the point of view of drug organizations is that there are many countries that were already vulnerable and fragile from an economic perspective. And the impact of going through COVID-19 and the shrinking of the global economy, the correlated shrinking of national economies is going to leave many of these countries quite vulnerable economically, entering into recessionary cycles that may be for an extended period of time. And the fear here I have is the vulnerability that these countries and their governance structures and institutions will be to infiltration by drug organizations and organized criminal elements. We've seen it already in several countries in the past, but I think going forward, this is going to be a real threat in many places of the world where governance institutions are going to have to, we're going to have to find a way to make them more resilient to being taken over and fending for the interests of organized crime.
Okay, so there's a number of small tasks there, nothing particularly major, right? Okay, and next up we've got Gabriel.
So I think in Brazil we are experienced last week's protests for democracy. Like we are in a very basic position now. Like our democracy doesn't exist anymore in actual terms, and it means that our population is not considered by the government as a whole, an entire population or a political community. I would say this population is divided by government and by political measures in two poles. One pole is considered to be the good citizen. The other pole is considered to be the thief or the criminal. And drugs are completely connected to this sense of being a criminal now in our country. So I do agree that we have to struggle now for decriminalizing, but it means a lot of things in Brazil, not only the drug use, but also the political action, the opposition, the poor people struggle for life, and etc. So I mean, I think illegal markets play a crucial role in the mechanism, the most important and most significant mechanism in Brazil now to criminalize people. And I mean, for example, things that I'm saying here could be used to say, no, this guy is defending, or this guy is supporting criminals, supporting criminal markets. I mean, supporting the way people think about drugs and etc. or liberty or freedom. For example, let's just to talk about one example. Our government said, talking about incarceration and etc. There's a lot of movements, human rights movements, acting exactly in the way Kasia was telling before. I mean, decarceration, saying it would be like catastrophic in the jail and etc. in the prisons. So the criminals, I mean, people who are arrested now must have the support of the government and their families and etc. with some money or cash transfer and etc. And the government responded saying, okay, no, the good citizens will have this support. And they act actively to avoid like the family of arrested people to have this benefit, to have the cash transfer. So we have now, my way of understanding this, that for the government, we are in a war. That's why we have a military police acting as it is acting now. I mean, we have a war against part of the so-called citizenship that for them are enemies. And the criminalization, the illicit markets, the drug markets, and etc. are a clear cut in this political strategy or struggle. So they are really trying to find some relation with drugs or to any small illicit act to say, okay, we have an essential criminal here. So I do agree that we have to act on this, but we have to be careful as well that if we talk about drugs in this moment, it will be understood by the other side as something that is criminal. It's not something that is a health issue or something related to individual freedom or to nothing like that. It's something related to crime. And as they say, we don't talk with criminals. We tackle them. So that's our situation here, just to understand how strong is the problem now.
Perfect. Okay, and finally, Alex.
Thank you. Yeah, just firstly building on the point raised by Jason, really echoing that in terms of the exploitation of state vulnerability and capacity. It's how, I mean, West Africa in a very short period of time turned into one of the main cocaine transiting hubs to Europe from South America by organized crime groups, transnational drug trafficking organizations, exploiting those vulnerabilities in the state. And if we talk about the Middle East in particular, what is going to come out, or what the region is going to look like after this huge global financial downturn is going to pose serious opportunities to various criminal groups, and they're definitely going to exploit those opportunities for their own winnings. In terms of the points raised by Naomi and Kasia, I think it's incredibly important that we talk about decriminalization, changes to laws, and I think as part of that, it's really important that we never make decriminalization contingent on mandatory treatment, we've seen in some countries, whereby as long as you have some sort of treatment certificate or you're enrolled in some harm reduction program, sure, then you might be let off the hook. Because what inevitably will happen, and has happened in many countries, in particular it's ongoing in Iran, is that the police still plays such an important role in terms of forcibly bringing drug users, the most vulnerable and marginalized drug users who are on the streets of urban places, into these treatment centers, into these so-called camps or compulsory drug detention centers for months on end, and where drug users essentially become commodities in a newly formed economy, whereby they're sold between different treatment centers or between different drug detention camps, basically, because these organizations can generate revenue by treating drug users. And so decriminalization should be in itself something, and it shouldn't be contingent on mandatory treatment or anything like that. It's just what I wanted to raise.
Okay, excellent. So we have a good number of questions and answers. I'm gonna go out over a few, and I think people can just pick which ones they'd like to address. The first one is actually two people did it. So it's Harry Shapiro, Director of DrugWise, and forgive me, just let me pull up the other's name. It's Anya Agarwal. And the question effectively centers on the shift to synthetics, right? That we've been talking about it pre-crisis, but whether, you know, traditionally produced drugs like opium, heroin, and cocaine or coca would be supplanted by synthetic drugs. And are we seeing COVID basically expediting that process, or do we see no evidence of that occurring? So it would just be interesting to get people's thoughts, and maybe it's too early to tell on this. Let me pull up another one. So Luton Sinfield, Community Safety Officer from Southwark Council in London. How has the consequences of COVID-19 lockdown impacted on local distribution patterns in London? Naomi, I suspect you might be able to speak to this. We hear there is less visible individuals are being recruited and exploited. Are they likely to be stopped? I'm not quite clear on what that means, but they're just saying anecdotally they hear that there's a varying effect on populations in London about who's being involved in the drug markets going forward. So maybe we can just stick with the fentanyl and synthetics, and maybe this impact on local communities as well. So who'd like to go first? Okay,
I'll jump in since we're going got the pattern. I think the question that Harry posed and Anya, I believe, about the role of fentanyl in the market's a really interesting one. I know that when we look at kind of the concentration of substances, a lot of people refer back to prohibition in the US in the 20s, where it's a really good example of where you need to hide something. The smaller and more concentrated it is, the easier it is. I think the count and the synthetics point, obviously, you know, even before COVID, we need to really think about the difference between producing drugs in a basement or a backyard somewhere versus the cost of shipping them. And that's got to be a big factor for markets all over the world. I think the counterpoint is always important to remember, you know, drug use and drug taking is not a mindless activity. It's an inherently human behavior. People don't just take drugs because they're offered to them. People have the drugs that they choose to take. You know, people choose drugs because it makes them feel a specific way. So moving from an opioid to fentanyl is not everybody's choice of drug. So I don't think we can say automatically that people are going to kind of slip along a stream or make choices simply because it's more available. Because choosing drugs is inherently about what you want the drug to do for you. That's a person-centered choice as opposed to being driven by the market. On London, I think that question is probably a little bit difficult to answer at the moment. I know that Release, the National Centre for Drug Policy in the UK, is doing some really interesting surveys. They've got a drug survey out there. And they're tracking changes to the drug markets and the experiences of people who use drugs on a weekly basis. We know that with very few people permitted to be out on the streets with lockdown, all kind of street-based begging, access to kind of, even petty theft is almost impossible when you're the only one in a small shop. We know that there's a vast reduction in funds available to purchase drugs, and that's kind of creating some ripples and some shifts in terms of people's choice of drugs and how they participate in the market. As we see opening up in London last week and this week, that's going to shift a little bit as well. But I encourage everybody to look out for the results of the release research.
So, John, if you allow me, I wanted to raise one point which I think will be significant as we move forward, and it does not have to do with the choices that people make in urban centers, or on the buyer side, as Naomi explained, but it's about people who produce. We are heading into a major global recession. I think we really need to keep in mind that for many people in Myanmar, in the Andes, across Latin America, in Afghanistan, production of the traditional drugs, be it cocaine, coca leaf for cocaine, or opium, or cannabis, is a way to survive, is a way to put food on the table. So, and then you have the large drug industry, which obviously will find its place in the market, and for them, the question of fentanyl or opium is probably less pertinent, because at the end of the day, it will be about making large amounts of money. But I think people who are transporting coca paste, people who are small actors in the drug industry, will also have something to say about this, because this is their livelihood. And so I do wonder whether the fact that we're heading into a recession is not an opportunity to have a conversation about legitimizing some of their work and finding a way for some of the coca growers to produce a product that we will be able to benefit from in ways that are other than cocaine, or maybe pharmaceutical cocaine. So I think this also is an opportunity to ask those questions, because we are talking about hundreds of thousands of already very impoverished families that are heading into even greater economic struggle. And so how do those dots connect between the Andes or London, and how does that impact an overall global market? Is not a question that I'm able to speak about, but I do want to point out that there are hundreds and thousands of people that are reliant for subsistence allowance on that production, and we can't just ignore it and assume that they can just be replaced.
If I may add to that as well, I think if we look at what the economic situation is, there's certain parts of the world that are in a very severe recession, and there's certain parts of the world that are actively in a depression. We could say the air travel industry is in a depression, commodities are in a depression. So the idea that these communities, which are completely reliant on illicit commodities, will move into a commodity sector or illicit commodity sector that is severely depressed prices is not realistic. So I think that's exactly as Kasia says, we have to be realistic about what policies we're putting forward to assist these communities. Okay, that's just my thought. Jason, do you want to jump in?
Sure. I think the question of Harry and Anya, is COVID-19 affecting or assisting a shift towards synthetics? I would say that we've been seeing a shift towards synthetics actually more broadly even before COVID-19. I think if we look at the global situation, when we talk about synthetics, and let's go beyond fentanyl and its analogs, let's also look at precursors that are used to produce methamphetamine and amphetamine and MDMA and synthetic cannabinoids. If we look at this, we know first that the two single largest suppliers of precursor chemicals and synthetics that are necessary for the synthetic drug industry are the pharmaceutical industries, chemical industries in both China and India. So the vast majority of chemicals that are found in illicit production sites around the world generally come from these 2 points of origin, with several exceptions, of course, in other areas, but we know this for certain. Secondly, we've seen significant seizures of synthetics and precursors more recently in volumes and in places where previously they didn't occur. So in December, we saw for the first time a dhow that was seized off the coast of Mozambique that had hundreds of kilograms of methamphetamine on it, in addition to its ton or ton and a half of heroin, which is unusual. This is a location where generally the supply had been domestic to the region, coming from South Africa to Mozambique, but all of a sudden this seizure occurred. Secondly, there was a seizure in Myanmar earlier this year, which was described as the single largest seizure of methamphetamine and precursors ever in the Asian region. Remember that the most common drug of use across East Asia is methamphetamine in, I think, every country but perhaps one. The volume seized and the volume that's generally estimated to be produced in the billions of pills, is this just for the East Asian market, or are large quantities of these drugs being moved to other markets around the world? I think if we look at the markets beyond just the fentanyls and look into the synthetic cannabinoids, we look at the Indian Ocean states, we look at the rise of the dark net as another means of channeling these drugs. And I think we're in a situation where synthetics are becoming more available in markets. Are people turning to using them? I think that's a bigger question, and I think Kasia and Naomi have addressed that to some degree. But I certainly think, from the point of view of a commodity, synthetics are becoming more common around the world and will continue perhaps to become more common because, of course, they're more efficient to produce and easier to move around.
Gabriel?
So I think if we think about the cocaine supply chain coming from Colombia and Bolivia and Peru, passing through Brazil, going to Europe, it's about $1 a grain in Colombia. You can buy cocaine for $1 a grain, and in London it would cost 100. So in Brazil now, the economic crisis is very tough, and at the same time, the real is devaluating. So before Bolsonaro, it was about 4 reais, $1. Now it's about 6. So if the cost of cocaine is increasing in London with the COVID, it will certainly push the Brazilian dealers to export more than to sell it internally. So, of course, it's much more value if you export something in this moment than if you sell it internally. So we are discussing this kind of shift here because 10 years ago it was not so strong, the exportation from São Paulo at least, and from Fortaleza and from other places, but it was already a tendency to have exportation of cocaine passing through Brazil and going to Africa and Europe. And with the economic crisis, with the COVID crisis, we see now, we are wondering about it. It's much more it's worth to export more than to sell it internally. So this could also be a consequence of this months of this year of crisis for the cocaine market. And in terms of other illicit markets, we could see other shifts as well, like car theft markets in Brazil were already experiencing a kind of professional tendency and more thefts than robberies, like reaching what happens in more developed countries. So during COVID crisis, we saw it most intensively as well. So I think there will be shifts, but in the same direction, the same tendencies we could recognize before. And in this sense, the COVID crisis would be a kind of accelerator of those changes by economic reasons and by political reasons as well.
Right, and Alex?
Yeah, thanks, John. Just building on Jason and Gabriel's points. I mean, between 2009 and 2016, about 106 countries and territories reported the emergence of 739 different new psychoactive substances to the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. The last decade has been exceptional in terms of the rise of these synthetic substances. But this precedes this last decade. I mean, in the year 2000, when the Taliban banned opium production in Afghanistan, we saw the emergence of heroin Kirak in Iran, which is a form of crystallized heroin, due to that shortage of regular opium heroin to the Iranian market. Organized crime adapts. These groups, they adapt, they're flexible, they come up with new modes of transportation, they come up with new substances to increase the price to value ratio. Is it likely that we'll see the emergence of new substances post COVID-19? I'd say so, absolutely. The world has changed as we know it. And why should not these groups who have already exploited the vulnerabilities of the system as it is, not exploit these new vulnerabilities and capitalize on them? So I think we're going to see many changes moving forward. Time will tell.
Great. So while we have 10 minutes left, I'm going to go through and try to assign a couple of questions. So we have some quite interesting ones. There was one from a prospective LSE student. I think it has disappeared now, but they were asking effectively about what I think Kasia answered in the last question. It's Sunny Singh. So I believe Kasia already answered your question on that front. Gabriel, we have Evelyn Guevara from Peru. She's asking, how do communities, this I think comes to a community resilience question. How do communities work to insulate themselves from these criminal elements, from predatory criminal elements, perhaps we could describe it, and more empower themselves to really manage their own security issues and their own health issues in these times? Jason, we have Anna Sergey from, and I know Ewan Grant has also been asking more or less this question, but Anna Sergey, who's a senior lecturer in criminology at Essex University, she suggested the strategic choices of drug trafficking organizations are less conscious than they usually might be, and that the port economy has been adapting to the challenges of COVID by also fragmenting shipping routes and redirecting cargo. And I gather what she's suggesting is maybe this is just a byproduct of broader changes in international trading patterns. Tony Duffin, hello to Tony and the team at Anna Liffey Drug Project. They're one of the groups that we mentioned at the start as frontline harm reduction service providers doing really outstanding work at this time. He was just saying, similar to Gabriel's narrative on Brazil, Ireland has seen no known impact on supply. As I said, this is a service provider who works with homeless populations, with groups, and so they would have good indications on this. There continues to be high-profile drug seizures reported in the media. There has been changes in drug trends, but these appear to be based upon drug dealers responding to the situation. For example, more crack cocaine rather than powder cocaine. He's asking, are there any indications of droughts specific perhaps to the pandemic? So that's sort of to everyone. Perhaps Alex, perhaps Gabriel, you could speak to that question. Kasia and Naomi, we had one which was about housing first. So effectively this point of, does this, we've seen it in some of the responses, some of the particularly European responses to COVID, is putting other issues aside and focusing more on getting people housed. Not in all cases, but I think in some. And I think the question is, I can't pull it up right now, but I think the question was effectively saying, does this not show the importance of this kind of policy going forward? So I think that might be enough for the moment. Apologies to everyone else's question I didn't get to, but maybe we can just go on those. So let's start again with Naomi. Let's just do the same order.
Okay.
Okay, great. Housing first. So I think we're at an interesting point at observing where housing initiatives and COVID are playing out for people who use drugs. We do see across middle income and high income countries like a surge of new interest and support for housing programs, getting people off the street, and largely consent based. I think from our preliminary monitoring of this area, we're not seeing like vast kind of swaths of exclusion of people who use drugs in this space, noting that normally this is a really contentious issue and a lot of people who use drugs are excluded from shelters or from temporary housing. I think the big challenge is lying ahead. The big challenge is what will happen when the government stops paying for hotels in city centres to house people who are street-based. You know, how do we support people to kind of retain some sense of stability and safety and a place to live? And I think there is an example, Athens right now has stormed ahead in a kind of a cross city council, NGO, drug agency kind of initiative, and they've got a shelter set up that's providing long-term housing for men and women who use drugs in the city. And I think that's the type of thinking we need. We need to be thinking about long-term solutions, not like temporary COVID solutions. And that shelter specifically for people who use drugs with unique needs. I think broadly, because I think we're heading towards our end point. I think it's really important to recognise that, you know, going into this crisis and going out of it, drug control will be a mechanism that's really convenient for politicians. You know, the securitization, the police on the street, the investment in punitive drug control. We know that over $100 billion is spent on punitive drug control annually, which absolutely dwarfs anything spent on community and health systems and support. And we really need to dismantle that and deconstruct all of our presumptions as to what we need the state to do, what we need the state to provide in terms of policing and security. And that will underpin any steps towards decriminalization. And I think we see that in all of our actions. Even some of the prison release schemes specifically exclude drug crimes. Like, drug policy is the ultimate example of exceptionalism. It's something you can always pull out and say everything but this. I think in order to really make progress moving forward, we really need to dismantle that and attack it and make sure it's no longer true. Thanks.
Super. And Kasia?
So again, I'm not sure how much of a direct answer to one of the questions this is, but there was a question about how community can sort of, you know, boost their own resilience and make sure that they're less vulnerable. So I would say that in my view, particularly when I think about the communities I mentioned earlier, which are growers, which are engaged in small scale drug production, you know, they are in that position because of lack of state, because of lack of investment. You know, whether you again look at the hills of mountains of Myanmar, or whether you look at the Andes, or whether you look at Afghanistan, this is where the state is not present. And so people are basically doing the best they can to survive under incredibly difficult set of circumstances. So I would say that in those particular examples, we really need the state to engage, because I think expecting that they can sort of master all that's whirling around them, and now as you pointed out, John, the potentially a huge economic depression, I think it's just not reasonable. I think we need positive state presence in those areas, so people actually have choices. And you know, maybe this will be a wake-up moment, and I hope it will, so they do not have to fend for themselves, but there will be someone else in a positive way helping them come up with a strategy that actually potentially reduces engagement in drug production and allows them to expand in illicit economies.
Great, thank you, Kasia. And then, so let's, Jason.
Thanks, John. I'm not sure I completely understand the question, but if it's around the ability of law enforcement to adapt alongside the adaptations taken by drug organizations, maybe I'll tackle it.
I may have misunderstood it, but my understanding was that drug organizations are basically piggybacking on commodity global trade changes anyway. So shipping
Yeah.
changed, and so that explains some of the shift. That's how I read it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, illicit markets as a whole benefit from licit markets, and high volumes of illicit trade make up or transit the corridors where illicit markets travel. The flexibility of illicit trade as well allows it to go outside of those channels, particularly where the risk of interdiction or the risk of detection is lower vis-a-vis the illicit channels. So the formal ports of entry, if they've become a bit more stringent, if a port, for example, is used where is particularly valuable when it's been infiltrated by organized crime, or they've corrupted an agent in the port, or the port itself lacks basic security, and it's a great way to move drugs in. But if those conditions change, then these flows can quite easily move to other channels, become informal entry off the coast using smaller boats or different ways. So I think yes, absolutely 100%. As licit flows change, illicit flows will continue to take advantage of that, and historically they've always done that. But I think the ability of illicit drug organizations to adapt is perhaps they're a bit faster than law enforcement agents are able to mirror them in this cat and mouse struggle of interdiction. I hope I got it.
Perfect. I'm not sure what happens when we get overtime, but we are overtime. So Gabriel and Alex, assuming we still have an audience, if you want to give a quick response.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with Jason and also with Kasia that the criminalization of those markets are very important to produce inequalities on it. I mean, violence is mostly focused in the basis of those markets. In middle classes in Brazil, there's a lot of drug trade. It's not repressed at all, and it's not violent at all. So there's a lot of drug trade in London that is non-violent drug trade at all. But of course, there's a lot of repression in the favelas in São Paulo, and we are talking about the same supply chain. So this, I think criminalization is a part of it. It's not the only thing we have to think about, but it is a huge part of it. And that is what is tricky about the community level solutions, because they are already criminalized from outside. So I think for the communities, as the question asked, I think it's more about connecting with another movements and trying to reinforce a public debate on what's going on and on inequalities. That's how we try to frame things here. I think drug dealing is part of an inequalities problem that is global, but also internal. And we had a lot of talk about that, but we have no time to do this. But it was nice to listen to you. Thanks a lot.
Perfect. Thank you. And Alex, last word?
Yeah, so thanks a lot for the question. I believe Tony often asked the question about shortages. Haven't heard much about it in the Middle East, except for certain perhaps times and certain substances, but not overall as a whole. A couple of weeks ago, all of a sudden, prices on opium and heroin doubled or even trebled in Iran. But that was the result of opportunistic traders rather than a change in the market. And it came very shortly after certain border points along the Irani-Afghanistan border were closed. But the prices changed so quickly that it couldn't have been because of that. It was more kind of a psychological, oh, well, the border is closing, so now we can actually make more money off these drugs. And then just echoing the previous points that have been made in relation to criminalization, it really creates a self-fulfilling prophecy, whether you're a farmer in Afghanistan or you're an ethnic minority in the borderlands or you're a street dealer in London. That militarized criminalization that's very disproportionately targeted against certain social groups creates further marginalization, which then makes people more reliant on these informal and illicit markets. And it's something that has to end.
Perfect. Thanks, Alex. Okay, we are over time, but just to say thank you to all of our speakers. Really, really fantastic and interesting discussions. This is not the last of these we will have, I'm sure, but it is the first, and I'm really delighted at how it's gone. Just to say another thank you to LSE Events, and also in particular thank you to the audience for joining us and for the great questions. Check out all of the organizations represented here. Check out the LSE Journal of Illicit Economies and Development, which Jason's organization is also a partner on. It's freely available online, so I'd encourage everyone to have a look. Other than that, stay healthy, stay safe, and thank you again for joining us.